Welcome back. This is episode 3 in my video series comparing the TDMM 14th edition with the 13th edition. Now last week, I talked about chapters 2, 3, and 4. This week, I'll be discussing chapter 5, Horizontal Distribution Systems, chapter 6, ICT Cables and Connecting Hardware, and chapter 7, Firestop Systems. Now while there are many minor changes in these chapters, I'll only be addressing what I feel to be the major ones. So let's get started. Chapter 5, Horizontal Distribution Systems. Well, first off, we can see that we now have 124 pages versus 110 in the old edition. On page 8, we'll see a modified figure 5.3 on channel connection points. On page 9, got a modified figure 5.4. And on page 10, we've got a modified figure 5.5. If we move on to page 13, we'll see that they fixed figure 5.7 to show active components. If you remember in the 13th edition, that middle component there was another patch panel, which didn't work, so they did fix that for us. If we move on to page 15, we'll see they modified figure 5.9. And if we move on to page 17, we'll see that they changed a loud media type section and removed OM1 and OM2 and added OM5 and OS1A. Moving on to page 18, slight modification of figure 5.10. And on page 19, they changed the cable slack in the TR from what was 10 feet to now saying the farthest corner of the TR plus floor to ceiling. Moving on to page 22, interesting change here. They removed the item box from outlet description there, and we've talked a lot about outlet versus outlet box. Moving on to page 23, added 2 bullets at the top of the page for the ICT designer to review pathways. On pages 37 to 43, there's a new section on simultaneous data and power transmission within horizontal cabling. So that's a good section there. It talks more about the heat generated when we use PoE systems. Good read on that one. If we move on to page 48, new section on fiber to the outlet. That actually goes from page 48 to 55. More good discussion on fiber to the outlet. Moving on to page 73. If we look towards the bottom of the page, next to the last paragraph, it says tables 5, 6, and 5, 7 provide guidelines and recommendations on conduit fill for horizontal cabling, assuming that a straight run of conduit is used and no conduit bends are applied. So remember that for a second. So we'll skip 5.6 for a minute and move on to 5.7. Description says, typical EMT conduit fill rate for varying cable diameters. Okay. But if we look under the note, it said the calculations in table 5.7 to determine cable fill are based on a 40% initial fill factor assuming straight runs with one 90-degree bend. Now that conflicts with a statement on the previous page. So what's the difference? Well, if we look at the numbers, and I actually did the calculations on it, this appears to be the table with no bends, which tells me that note is incorrect. So if we use that as a basis and look at table 5.8, which says this is cable fill with one bend, if I run those calculations, that appears to be correct. And if I look at table 5.9, which says runs with two 90-degree bends, running the calculations there also confirms that one. So that leaves us with table 5.6, and I can't figure out where that one fits in there. So if anybody knows the purpose of that one, is the description wrong, how the calculation's made, I have a real concern on table 5.6. Now moving to page 80, they fixed the table 5.10 to show conduit bend radius versus cable in the old edition. And finally on page 115, they took out the section on overflow ducts. Chapter 6, ICT Cables and Connecting Hardware. Not much to talk about here. If we go to page 4, the table is updated to show Cat 8 and OS1A, among a few other minor changes. And that's it for Chapter 6. Chapter 7, Firestop Systems. We now have 53 pages versus the 57. If we go to page 29, they changed to show silicone foam is now not recommended. On page 43, we've got some new information. And that's it for Chapter 7. So there are changes in Chapters 5, 6, and 7 for you. Now each week, I'll ask for your input, and it'll be the same 2 questions every week. In the comments section below, I'll ask you to put a +1 if you believe the changes were beneficial to the chapter, or a -1 if you feel they were not. And for my benefit, place a C if you think it should remain a core chapter, or an NC if you feel it should be moved to a non-core status. If you want to learn more about both our RCDD and Outside Plant Review courses, you can contact me at davidc@von2learningnetwork.com or my direct line at 813-841-8000. Hope you'll join me next week for our continuing review of the TDMM, and thank you for watching.